Hey everyone, how's it going? And today, we're going to be covering an Elseworld. What's an Elseworld? Some of you newcomers might be asking. Well,
Elseworld started out as an imprint of DC Comics in the late 80s with the comic Gotham by Gaslight, which told the story of where Batman started his crime fighting in the 1800s and faced off against Jack the Ripper. And with the success, began this new imprint, lasting up until 2003, where we'd get several stories of interesting and imaginative new takes on our favorite heroes, like what if Baby Kal-El landed in Gotham City and was raised by the Waynes, or a version of the Justice League that started out in the Old West, or a story where Batman teams up with Harry Houdini.
And believe me, I'm going to talk about that one.
As I mentioned, the Elseworld imprint would eventually end in 2003, but would make a minor return in 2009 with the story The Last Family of Krypton.
After that, Elseworlds had new meaning. No longer being its own imprint, it became a term for just stories in the DC universe that were out of continuity. In fact, many other imprints like Black Label, Vertigo, and Young Animal, which, man, at some point I'm going to have to talk about Young Animal at some point. Whatever. Point is, those imprints wound up getting their own Elseworld stories. And that's pretty much it. With that covered, let's talk about today's review, that being Batman of Arkham. Now, this story has a very interesting premise. We've all seen Batman take on his criminals and send them to Arkham Asylum, where they will, be treated by the doctors. But what if Batman was one of the doctors?
Now, let's get started on the story. Written by a longtime writer, Alan Grant, we open to Gotham City in the 1900s, where we see classic Batman villain Two-Face attempt a robbery, but is thwarted by Batman. Now, obviously, we know how the song and dance usually goes. Batman stops the villain swears vengeance, and goes to Arkham Asylum, where they'll get usually very poor treatment, break out, most likely killing a few employees who were actually good, only for Batman to capture them, and the cycle begins anew. But, lo and behold, it doesn't. Harvey is actually doing okay, and it's all thanks to his psychiatrist and owner of the asylum, Dr. Bruce Wayne, who, after watching his parents get killed, not by a gun-wielding mugger on the street, but instead a sword-swinging madman at the circus. Obviously, this event would traumatize Bruce, and he would vow that he would not just bring justice to Gotham's criminals, but also treat some of them, to both ensure that this will never happen again to any other child, and to figure out his own personal question of why do some men kill. Though he hasn't been able to get that answer, he has been doing fairly well with his patients like Killer Croc, Poison Ivy, and the Ventriloquist. But that doesn't mean things are easy for Bruce. He has to deal with people like Dr. Crane, one of his employees who believe that Bruce's more compassionate methods have no place in this institution, preferring the more archaic works of what was going on at the time. And as Batman, dealing with the Joker, the latest villain to come to Gotham, who has been driving people crazy thanks to his Joker toxin. And though Bruce was able to keep his identity safe, he is unfortunately committed to his very own asylum, and now Crane is in charge. Will the help of one of his patients be able to snap Bruce out of it, or is Arkham truly a place where sanity is just a fantasy? I'll leave it up to you. This is a great story with an interesting themes and a simple yet amazing premise. We've seen many Batman stories where he offers to help his enemies get the help they truly needed, but his kind of help can only go so far. In the end, it's up for the professionals to treat them.
And unfortunately, when it comes to Arkham, professional is really just by name only.
But here, we actually get to see how he would do it as a psychiatrist, and placing it in the 1900s is perfect since this was around the time psychology was going through a massive shift in methods. The only downside is that I believe the book is too short, and I feel like we could have gone even deeper than it actually did. Plus, flesh out a few of the characters, or at least give them more something to do, like Ivy, Two-Face, or the Ventriloquist, instead of just Croc. Speaking of, let's get into the characters, starting with, of course, Batman. Now, this is an interesting one since this is a Batman who's never truly off duty since he's constantly dealing with Gotham's criminals as both the Dark Knight, fighting and bringing in the criminals, and then as Dr. Bruce Wayne, who has to treat the criminals, with there not being that much of a difference in personality or demeanor, besides Bruce being slightly more gentler to the criminals, which makes sense since, he's a doctor. And you can tell that he really does care for them and will do anything to get them help. Now, obviously, we do dive into the classic, is Batman just as crazy as his foes question? But it's briefly mentioned and can be easily missed. Next up we have Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc. This was a very interesting take, and this ended up inspiring later stories, having Croc be on the more heroic side, or at least leaving it to the opportunity of him possibly getting out of the criminal life. Now, when I say heroic, I don't mean he goes around fighting crooks, but when Bruce needs help after being infected, he makes a really risky move just to help a doctor who, unlike the others, treat him not as an animal, but a human being. Finally, we got the antagonists, Joker and Dr. Crane. With Joker, unfortunately don't have much to say, which is a shame since he is my favorite villain, period. But in this story, he's kind of a dragon, this obstacle that Batman has to overcome. Sure, he does have some interesting lines, but we really don't get to know much about this world's Joker. Jonathan Crane, on the other hand, is very interesting. Not really of who he is or what he does, but more of what he represents, that being Arkham itself. In many continuities, Arkham Asylum is usually described as a hell on earth, a nightmare that will never go away, an epicenter of madness itself that can never be stopped. We have seen many attempts to reform it, move it, even destroy it, but nothing works. Crane is essentially Arkham fighting back on Bruce's methods, on helping the patients, because in its nature, Arkham is not usually the true place of healing.
There are many other characters like Alfred Pennyworth, Richard Grayson, and Jim Gordon, but they really don't do much outside of just being there because, well, they're classic Batman characters.
Now we have the artwork that was done by Enrique Acatina. I hope I pronounced that right. And I must say, it is perfect for this kind of story. It has that amazing gothic style, and you really get the sense of madness and horror with the characters' expressions. Though, and I know it's not just me, this artwork does look very similar to the works of horror manga writer / artist Junji Ito, especially if you look at the cover. I mean, with the Asylum's face, I'm half expecting a spiral to pop up. But honestly, that's not even a complaint, merely an observation. I will say though, one thing I do have a problem with is the whole thing with Crane's shadow. For some reason, they constantly put a scarecrow behind him because, well, in the comics, Jonathan Crane becomes a scarecrow. I wouldn't mind if it happened like maybe once or twice, but no, this pops up a lot and it's not really threatening or clever. It's just kind of, okay, I get it, he's a scarecrow. But honestly, that's the only complaint I have on it. We also get some stylized panels with certain characters, which is not uncommon in stories like these. It's not bad, though I'll admit I have seen it done better in other stories like A Serious House on a Serious Earth, since it really plays with it in a very trippy way. But in this book, it's not bad, just okay. In the end, I have to say, it was a pretty good story, but I feel like a lot more could have been done here, and Grant could have had something really amazing. But what we did get was alright.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. And for the next review, well, in here, we talked about themes regarding enemies helping one another, and we're going to continue that. But instead of DC, we're going to move on to IDW Comics.